We have our second keynote address by David Rokeby, who will be speaking about catastrophic practice. A few words about David Rokeby. He was born in Tillsonburg, Ontario in 1960. He's been creating interactive sound and video installations with computers since 1982, so since his early youth. His early work, Very Nervous System, from 1982 to 1991, is acknowledged as a pioneering work of interactive art, translating physical gestures into real-time interactive sound environments. Several of his works have addressed the issue of digital surveillance, including Watch from 1995, Taken from 2002, and Sorting Daemon from 2003. Other works engage in critical examination of the differences between human and artificial intelligence. The Giver of Names, 1991 to present, and Enchant, 2001, are artificial subjective entities provoked by objects or spoken words in their immediate environment to formulate sentences and speak about them. David Rokeby's installations have been exhibited extensively in the Americas, Europe, and Asia. In 2002, Rokeby was awarded a Governor General's Award in Visual and Media Arts, the Prix Ars Electronica Golden Nica for interactive art for Enchant, and represented Canada at the Venice Biennale of Architecture with Scene in 2002. In 2004, he represented Canada at the São Paulo Bienal in Brazil. In 2010-11, Rokeby was a guest artist at Le Fresnoy Studio Nationale in Tourcoing, France, and artist in residence at the Ryerson Image Centre at the Ryerson University in Toronto. So without further ado, I present David Rokeby.
I want to thank all the organizers, Melenti and Tom, and everyone who helped install the pieces. It was a great team. It's all been really great so far. I've never really experienced a catastrophe, so I feel like a bit of an imposter talking about catastrophe. But catastrophe theory spoke to me when I read about it in the early 80s. And I fell hard for British novelist Nicholas Mosley's 5-novel Catastrophe Practice series. Partly inspired by catastrophe theory, which explored in depth how one might, as the title suggests, practice for catastrophe. While catastrophe theory provides mathematical models to explain how radical change can erupt from within apparent stability, my interest is focused on another sort of catastrophe, where the human craving for stability and our ability to solidify things into language, cognitive and scientific models, habits of interpretation, and technologies can result in a fragile self-referential structures prone to catastrophic collapse. While the word catastrophe implies disaster on a massive scale, in the sense of the word that I'm most interested in, catastrophes can just as easily be small, domestic, and momentary, situations where our personal internal versions of things suddenly fail to account for what is happening around us. In my art practice, I've often focused on this question. How do we live and act, and more importantly, act responsibly and responsively in situations which are no longer in our control, in which the results of our actions are not entirely predictable? So what might it mean to practice for catastrophe? So now in thinking about presenting this, this keynote, I realized that I said almost everything I want to say in an article I wrote in 1984 for MusicWorks magazine called Predicting the Weather. And so I'm going to, well actually I'm not going to do that yet. I'm going to give you a tiny sample of video from the piece that Melenti mentioned, Very Nervous System, because it forms a foundation for a lot of what I'm going to talk about, and it's also the thing that the text I'm about to read from 1985 sort of takes as a starting point. So first, Very Nervous System, which is a piece I started in the early 80s, which translated body movement into sound or music. I won't say much more about it except for the fact that we're seeing the camera that's documenting this is also the camera that's the sensor that's collecting the information about body movement that is triggering and stimulating and causing the modulations of the sound that we're hearing at the same time. And so hopefully this will, managing your cursor on a two-screen system. So that represents state-of-the-art catastrophe practice in 1991, I believe. So I am now going to read this text from 1985, which feels like it sums up the points I was originally writing into the text better than anything I was trying to write right now. So I'm going to start with that, and I'm going to accompany it with, by happy coincidence, a project I did a couple of years. Oops, it started already. Stop. I want to introduce it properly. There, okay. I promised Paul I would include some clouds in my project. So, so this is a piece that is really just an archive of the weather for a year. Archive of the horizon, the sky and the water near Oakville Galleries in Oakville, Ontario, near Toronto. I'd done a previous work called Machine for Taking Time that cataloged the passage of the seasons over 3 years in the garden, using a camera panning across the garden, taking 1,000 images a day. And this took, again, 1,000 images a day over the course of about 4 years, looking straight out into the lake. I love the novel Cloud Atlas. It was kind of my Cloud Atlas, as among other things, sort of catalog, comprehensive catalog, kind of my staring at Mont Victoire, but I didn't have to be there because modern technology makes life easier. It's not exactly relevant, except that perhaps it's a sort of slow way to catalog climate change, but I think it forms a nice background for the text. So I will start it again. And just to say, there was a camera looking out, straight out there, computer was recording images, and the piece is just the computer panning around the image. So it's a still large image and it moves around, and the installation has an extremely long length because it just flips through these images, which are taken about 40 seconds apart over the course of the day from sunrise to sunset for these 3 or 4 years. Okay, so, good. Predicting the weather. Very nervous system. 3 cameras observe the movements of people in a room. They relay their images to a computer. The computer analyzes these images and translates the results into sound using a digital synthesizer. I have to move my position because there were 2 voices in this. Whenever the weatherman makes a mistake, we feel betrayed. It is his job to predict the weather, and he fails over and over again. It seems as though any experienced farmer can tell you as much about the next day's weather as the meteorologists armed with their satellite photos and Cray supercomputers. Cray supercomputers certainly dates this text. Back here, I am always being asked if the response to my sound installations is predictable. Will a specific movement always create the same sound? I remember huddling in a tent in the pouring rain during the tail end of a hurricane on Prince Edward Island and being informed by the local radio station that the skies were clear and the sun shining. The source of our anger and sense of betrayal runs deeper than damage to shoes due to unexpected rain. It's lovely to inhabit the language you spoke when you were in your 20s. It's very reminiscent. The source of our anger and sense of betrayal runs deeper than damage to shoes due to unexpected rain. We seem to feel the same resentment towards accidental death. We have learned to expect a life deprived of surprises. Such things shouldn't happen in a properly organized, rational society. We write letters to our government representatives. I used to get very defensive, quickly explaining that it was next to impossible to repeat movements exactly. It's as though a sacred trust is broken or an inviolable right infringed every time events elude our understanding and control. In the text, these were in different fonts, so it was a little easier to detect. Imagine an uncharted planet. The atmosphere is more intimate than Earth's, and we personally affect the weather. Some people run through my installations as though they were afraid of getting wet. We seem to be victims of a sort of intellectual materialism. Just as we as a society have come to accept the financial yardstick as the measure of value, We have accepted logical proof, ergo predictability, as the only yardstick for measuring truth. The computer program which interprets motion and translates it into sound makes perfect sense at the foundational level. That level of sense, however, is not completely accessible through the experience of the piece. It is obscured by its own complexity. Any attempt to solely rationally understand the work is automatically doomed to failure. Money and logic are removed from subjective reality and therefore can serve as incorruptible media of translation and communication. We reduce our lives to functions of lowest common denominators and in the process lose contact with both subjective reality of the individual and the integrated reality of the whole. The active ingredients of life slip through our fingers. All we have left are facts and a basic mistrust of anything we can't pin down. It seems that the more intent one is in controlling my installation, the less predictable the response becomes. This sound is, I'm starting to enjoy the sound. The noise of information becomes nonsense. The surprises and accidents multiply. Dazzled and dispirited by the impossibility of absolute understanding, we begin to behave irresponsibly, paying little attention to the results of our actions. Still, the mind is tantalized by apparitions of order. One gets no sleep. How can I be expected to act responsibly if I don't know what's going to happen? With my computers, cameras, and synthesizers, I present a synthetic reality which can be physically explored. The phenomena through which the underlying principles of this reality are articulated are the sound events. The phenomena are instigated by and related to various aspects of the dynamics of the movements of the explorer. Or else we condemn and ignore reality as a sloppy manifestation of eternal and unchanging laws, doubting the weather instead of the weathermen. And this also dates it. The Soviets are controlling our weather. Though the behavior of this installation is complex enough to resist, this is going to end soon, so I have to be on synchronization. Complex enough to resist absolute analytical comprehension, it is integrated enough to create a strong, though veiled, and overall impression of orderedness and relatedness. Absolute projection and control of very complex situations is not possible, and partial control often disastrous. The universe chooses its own way to return to equilibrium. We must learn to accept this fact without abdicating from the responsibility for the results of our actions. Refining awareness of the ways in which we affect our physical and metaphysical environments is the only way to avoid increasing the apparently chaotic and cataclysmic behavior of the universe. Weather is becoming interactive, as in acid rain. Imagine exploring the body of a new lover. A certain flexibility is required. Here we go. Nobody warned me. Okay. We'll just stop there with this mysterious picture. A certain flexibility is required, an ability to move with grace back and forth between informed intelligence and naive perception. The question of unpredictability and the sense of chaotic confusion seem to disappear simultaneously at the point at which one suspends one's disbelief and begins exploring to discover rather than exploring to confirm. How does one best function within a situation one cannot hope to entirely understand? So, there were 4 things that I said in this text which continue to be really relevant to me. The first was that it seems that the more intent one is in controlling my installation, the less predictable it becomes. And there was a really fascinating scenario I saw play over and over again when I showed Very Nervous System at the SIGGRAPH trade show in Atlanta in 1988, I think it was. So I'm putting my interactive sound installation in the context where there are military researchers and computer graphics professionals and a lot of skepticism about interactivity. And I would see people walk into my interactive space. There was a room with classic convention pipe and drape with a whole bunch of other pretty crazy art installations. And people would walk into the installation and you could see as though a white lab coat was forming around them. They were going to do the first test of interactivity. If I make the same movement, will I get the same sound? And they would walk into the space, and they would just sort of ennobled in their position as scientists, and they would make a gesture to the space, and they would hear a sound, and you could see them write it in the blackboard in their mind, certain sound result, excellent, okay. Then they would make the gesture again, and they would hear the same sound, all is going well, the scientific method is at work. And then they would make the gesture again, and they would hear the same sound, and because the modern compressed scientific method only requires this triple repetition, they would realize that they had learned something about the system, that they were now in control, and they made a gesture to make that sound. And every single time it would make a different sound because the system was responding to the complex kinetic dynamics of the movement. So that, oh my God, okay, that was a mistake, we'll try again. Step back into the objective position of science. They would make the gesture, they would hear the sound, all's good. They'd do this. I saw people go through this process 3 or 4 times and never realized that they'd betrayed themselves in the very act of intentionality and that they had not a sufficient understanding of the complexity of the system they were engaging with. So, interesting, complicated scenario. In general, and also I found that for myself, people are always saying, David, you're obviously the expert. Can you please demonstrate very nervous system for us? Which is a real problem because to demonstrate the system, to show, oh, it can do this and do this and do this, was exactly counter to what the piece was intended for, which was to create a space where you were forced to open to possibility. And so I had to learn to prepare myself to do the most boring things imaginable with all these people watching, so I could enter the space where I was just being open to what was around me. And that was really interesting to discover at that point, when you were open to it, the cycle of feedback and feed forward and intentionality and desire and fear and would work beautifully, and the whole system made sense. But if you set to control it, it always felt bad. It felt awkward, it felt non-functional, and that, for me, set up a really interesting relationship. Second thing was, the universe chooses its own way of returning to equilibrium. That's the one thing. We're really good at building things up, but the way things fall apart is usually not under our control. Slightly off topic, I want to tell the story right now of Boltzmann's S theorem. Ludwig Boltzmann, who was trying to solve the problem of entropy. And I like this story because it seems to be an example of a scientist reaching beyond the limits of what he can verify to make a larger leap and the results of that leap. So Boltzmann was trying to solve entropy, the way in which the world would increasingly head towards heat death at the end of the universe. And the problem that it always seems to increase in one direction, the times arrow hole challenge. And he came up with a proposition. He had his S theorem, and he proposed it in a paper, and it was roundly dismissed by the physicists of the day. And they were right. They disproved his theorem. It was clearly wrong. And he came back with a second paper, and he said, okay, if my S theorem is wrong, there's only one other possibility. And that possibility is that the size of the universe, as we imagine it, is massively tiny in comparison to what the universe really is. We've shown the paucity of our imagination, and that the universe is actually already at heat death. We have already reached the end of thermal equilibrium. And the entire universe that we imagine is both one side of a bubble in this already existing equilibrium. And on one side of this bubble, entropy increases with time, and on the other side of the bubble, it decreases with time. And our whole universe is just the side of this, what we imagine the universe is just the side of the bubble. What was really interesting was when he published this paper, the response of the physicists of the day was, that's inhuman, which is kind of a bizarre response. Anyway, he later committed suicide, so he was clearly committed to irreversible processes. Anyway, a bit of a side line there. So, how can I be expected to act responsibly if I don't know what's going to happen? John Cage explained how badly we misunderstand freedom. He said that freedom was not a state where you can do anything with impunity. Freedom is the freedom to act and to accept the consequences. This requires cultivating the ability to act without certainty and to be aware of the unfolding results in a continuous stream of engagement. In retrospect, I created Very Nervous System partly as a space to learn and practice this kind of integrated engagement. Finally, of the 4 points that I'm pulling out here, a certain flexibility is required and ability to move with grace back and forth between informed intelligence and naive perception. And I think the best story to illustrate this notion was a very odd and awkward experience I had with language. I was working on a piece that I was intending to call Echoing Narcissus, that was drawing on the myth of Echoing Narcissus and my sense that Narcissus was sort of the patron nymph of interactive art, which you'll have to read somewhere else because I don't have time to talk about it. But I was talking about this project that I wanted to do around Echoing Narcissus at this lecture that was given by Daniel Charles, famous French musicologist who was a close friend of John Cage. And he charged over and he said, you have to write something about this for the next issue of Revue Esthétique. And I was really excited, and I went home and I wrote a text, labored over a text, and crafted this text that I really, really loved. I really thought this was a good text. And I sent it off, and then I had to make the piece. And it was hell. The piece could not be made in the presence of the text. The text had taken me somewhere that the piece couldn't go to. And in every step of trying to make the piece, I had to destroy the text, to break it apart and throw it out the window. And it took a month to remove the text so I could actually make the work. In his diaries, Austrian writer Peter Handke at one point talks about formulation as the beginning of forgetting. What is gained when language is applied to phenomena is the ability to externalize the experience as a token that can be stored in writing, for example, manipulated with reasoning and shared with communication. Coining is a term, is an act of power. And Adam in the Bible is the giver of names, charged with the responsibility to bring nature under his dominion through the act of naming. But in the same time, something precious and harder to define is lost. What started as a live, multidimensional, organic, and complex interrelation is crystallized into a symbol disjunct from context and experience. It loses its conceptual suppleness. It becomes a stereotype of the thing that it's intended to represent. So around this whole thing, and at this time, I started to imagine what I would now call catastrophes of language. We're driven to resolve uncertainty and contradiction. We love to pack complicated things into words that make us think that we have things figured out. We build systems and laws and customs around these resolved concepts and words, and they become the bedrock of assumptions that anchor our civilization. They become givens, unassailable. Time and situations change, and the words and habits slowly fall out of sync with the world around us, but we don't see this disjunction. As McLuhan said, I'll see it when I believe it. Now, I'm going to take a little side jump to this very strange video I'm going to show you. I don't know how many of you are aware of the deep dreaming experiments that are coming out of Google's neural network labs. Basically, Google released a bunch of code that shows what goes on inside neural networks that are trying to identify images. And the most interesting thing that came out of that was the way that things that are trying to identify things project strongly onto the world, the things that they know. And this is very powerfully visualized. This is a little bit of video from the film Inception that has been processed twice through this deep dreaming code. And you'll notice, I'm going to back up a tiny bit. For me, it's an incredibly clear evocation of the way that we project onto the world. That, we're mostly putting out. We're getting senses in, but we're mostly filling in the gaps. We're doing all sorts of things to fabricate this impression of reality. And this often involves imposing ideas onto the world, and so we see what we believe. And this is a kind of a technological implementation of that, accidentally, inside the tools that are fueling Google image search and things like that. Yeah, if I can find my mouse. Okay, I'm just going to go back a tiny bit. Oops, not that far. So you'll find, well, I'll just talk over it. So it's looking really hard for things it knows about. And I think this one is only trained on two things, a certain kind of tower and eyes or mouths. I'm not sure which, it's unclear. So everywhere there's a bit of ambiguity in the image, or the possibility to interpret it, it interprets it in this particular form of architecture. And everywhere there's something that is resembling an eye orifice, it becomes generalized into that orifice-like shape. And if you watch what's happening to her hair, it's completely insane. It's completely hallucinogenic. It's hallucinating into, especially the dark spaces, everywhere that's unresolved. And where things are clear, things are held into under a little more control. What I find interesting about, from a pure position of someone who does a lot of image processing, what's interesting about this for me is that there's an actual, not just a transformation of the image, but a reconstruction of the image based on other assumptions and other systems that are happening. And that's, we're capable of that in our own vision systems. Massive fiction engine that we have that generates a sense of reality we put out there. And we can avoid things that we don't want to see, hear, or understand through this system. Things, let's see, okay, so I'm going to step back into the text here. It's important to understand how hard our cognitive system works to make reality fit our expectations. Eyes are projectors. We interpret everything in terms of what we already understand. Things that are ambiguous or unfamiliar are forced to conform to our expectations or become invisible. This was very clear in early presentations of Very Nervous System, where people would just grasp at the most immediate explanation for what was going on and then hang on to that for dear life, despite any contradictions and things like that. The unease and underlying sense of disjunction that has us holding tighter to the life raft of assumptions and familiar ideas, shoring it up with a fundamentalism until hardness turns to brittleness and the structure suffers a catastrophic collapse. And I kind of find this, even if we look at the difficulties of the right wing coming to terms with Islam, we see this kind of this impossibility of registering difference because we're only seeing what we understand. This is the sort of catastrophe I'm most interested in. Unnatural catastrophes that arise when hubris, power, and self-righteousness lead to fragile constructions that carry the seeds of their own destruction. Very Nervous System taught me about a suspended floating space of non-resolution where one can be active, expressive, sensitive, and responsive in the world without labeling everything and bringing it under your control. To move with grace back and forth between informed intelligence and naive perception, where wonder and knowledge do not extinguish each other but can coexist and continue to inform each other. I became curious after Very Nervous System about the process through which we encode, sensed, and received reality in both language and code and data, and embarked on the installation of the giver of names, which I'm going to show you a little bit of next. And I apologize to those of you who have seen a lot of these examples, but some of you haven't, so you're going to have to live with them. So the giver of names, there are a bunch of objects on the floor. You can pick anything you want up off the floor and build a still life, and as soon as it's still, the camera grabs an image of that and starts to analyze it, to try to make sense of it. So it looks at outline, tries to find the true colors, tries to reduce shadow and highlight so it can come up with simplification of the image that it can then try to understand. So here we see it going through the process, finding outlines and then trying to simplify the colors into flat planes and trying to reduce highlights. And you can't believe how hard this was to do. It was really an interesting thing to learn how hard it is to do what we take for granted with our eyes all the time. So there it is isolating outlines, and it's using this to stimulate its knowledge base of 100,000 words or ideas. And so what happens is it's sort of free associating based on this input and generating these landscapes. You sort of see in the background the words that are stimulated by different objects. This is a sort of landscape of stimulated ideas. Each one is in the color of the object that's stimulating it. And then from this landscape, it looks at the peaks and valleys and tries to formulate a sentence that says something about what we're seeing there. So in this case, we'll just give you one simple example where it's analyzing this strange child's toy and this plastic, I don't know, horn for Wagnerian opera or something.
To that devotion, the steadfastly orange or round flog this syphilitic round deep plenitude.
That was a particularly good one. I mean, horns, cornucopia, plenty, raininess, horniness. It's all good there. I'm very, like a proud father. This is one example of the bad thing about this installation is it always sucks when a big curator comes into the room. It will say really dumb, stupid things, but that's part of the chaos I've invited into my life. Okay, so as I was working on the artificial perception system, it became clear that if decisions were made too early in the perceptual process, so too early in determining colors and shapes and relationships between objects, if that were done too early in the process, the process of recognition or understanding became very fragile. Impressions had to float in a suspended state of mutual influence, feedback, and feed forward for as long as possible, a kind of creative procrastination. I spent a great deal of time figuring out how to hold the incoming rich but unresolved impressions of the objects in this state for as long as possible. This is particularly challenging in code, as programming seems to be all about decisions. Each time you make a decision, you can compress a messy bunch of data into a much more compact representation, and it makes the programmer's life easier. And now, to quote from an old text of mine that relates very much to something that Andrew was talking about. The computer is best imagined as a vacuum, a protected space in which all ambiguity has been removed. The main engineering problem in the design of a computer is the containment of that vacuum. Computers are made of humble earthly materials like silicon with complex nonlinear analog behaviors that are not inherently suited to the logical precision desired. The basic component of the computer, the transistor, is still a fluid analog device. To attain digital precision, these transistors are pushed through massive amplification of positive feedback to their absolute limits, a peculiar form of violent self-referentiality. Through this process, all but the extremes, the zeros and the ones, the voltage rails that Andrew was talking about, that form the terms of the restricted language of the digital, are effaced. This violence has serious repercussions. The rapid switching from one state to the other produces enormous amounts of extraneous noise. And this required, and ringing, if you look at the digital waveform, there's all this crazy stuff that happens after the transition. This required a second innovation, the clock, which carefully times the procession of digital decision-making to occur at the first possible moment after each chaotic transition is settled. If we think of a catastrophe as a sudden and unexpected rupture in the orderly unfolding of events, we can perhaps think of every flip of a bit as a precision-engineered catastrophe, an almost instantaneous change from one state to another, from one state to its opposite, with little or no relationship to its context. So that's an interesting challenge, and that's partly in relationship to this question of simulation too. It's through this really many layers. The simulation is also happening inside the processor itself. If we think, let's see, so I find myself wondering whether I can engineer the reverse to create spaces that support and extend states of unresolved ambiguity, to hold open rather than collapse possibility and potential for long enough for us to find ourselves slipping past our habitual thoughts and relationships and find other options and resolutions. I think I'm not going to, I was going to talk about the Boltzmann machine, which is a really interesting device, but I think it was also dealt with this idea of local minima being a problem. I think it was in Tom's talk. We were talking about the attractors. We get stuck in local, simple solutions that are close to the problem, and we don't find the really deep. Oh, there I go, showing what I didn't want to show yet. Let me just go back. Okay, there we go. And so there, yeah. So, sorry.
It's playing.
Oh, crap. The space bar to stop is not working for me. Okay, there we go. One way to put the Boltzmann machine is that you use heat to generate some chaos in a system that's trying to settle to a solution. If you just let it settle, it finds local, so-called local minima, easy solutions that are not the optimal ones. By generating some heat, you actually agitate it enough that they settle into more appropriate solutions. I sometimes think of anger as like our own personal Boltzmann machine. We get angry when something's irresolvable, and that anger is like heating us up, and it creates some chaos in our thought processes, and sometimes allows us to hop outside of our standard solutions and find a more optimal solution. But that's a sort of a side thing. I'm going to jump to this piece that you've already seen a little bit of here. In 2010, I was one of 7 artists invited by the Ryerson Image Centre in Toronto to explore their archive of 300,000 prints from the Black Star Photo Agency, containing many of the most iconic photojournalistic images of the 20th century, and to produce works in response. My experience of the archive was a curious one. The archive is ordered in an arbitrary way based largely on the systems and processes that maybe I don't have to say all this. What I'm going to say is that in the process of doing the Giver of Names, I learned to love blur, because blur helps you resolve things. If you try to understand an image from all the detail, you get lost in excesses of information. So I have used blur as a really important element in my artistic toolkit for a long time. It helps to generalize, helps you to back away from the excessive information and settle into solutions rather than try to determine them from all the detail. So what I did for this piece, I had this experience of looking at these images which I knew were historically important, and I was fighting between my desire to blur the image and feel it as a visual landscape and to look at detail which would help me locate it in place and time. So I created a piece that would unfold or unravel what is usually a process of having the eye scan the image, collecting data, and coming to a determination of when that image was, to draw it out over the course of about 2 minutes, using the artifice of an artificial fovea. The center part of our eye is extremely narrow. As we read, it has to skip across the page because we cannot resolve the detail of text in more than about a toonie held at arm's length, that much of our eye. So I use an artificial fovea to roam these images, which start out blurred, to slowly reveal what's happening, to have a prolonged period of an ambiguous state of an image before it finally collapses into observability at the end. So let me see if I can, there we go. And I'm particularly interested in the fovea because as the part of the eye that can resolve resolution, it's very different from from peripheral vision, which is occupied with totally different activities. So between the fovea, which is all about resolution, and the periphery, which is about something totally different, we have this complicated dialogue going on in our visual world. This is all aware of sort of a sense of being in space and a sense of movement, and this is all about making determinations and identifications of things. So I was trying to extend this relationship as far as possible. We can think of this maybe as a sort of slow collapsing of a wave function, slowing down the process of observing and then pinning something down. So by interjecting this sort of delay into that process, unraveling the process of seeing. 5 points to anyone who can identify this news story. Chappaquiddick. For those born after the millennium, that was Edward Kennedy. Edward Kennedy? Yes, Ted Kennedy. Ted Kennedy having a car crash with a young female aide in his car, crashing into the water, caused lots of scandal, removed his possibility of being president for the rest of his life. It's the second one. A lot of the images from this archive are related to the topic of this one. This is a particularly poignant one. I'm also interested in the odd experience when we return to full resolution at the end of these. This is in a small hallway that's not as wide as this stage on a large video wall. And when the image comes into full detail, you physically feel like you have to step back because the detail actually almost has a physical pressure that pushes on you. You get sort of so settled into this really focused and swirling in a fog of vague impressions. So it's a primary interest to me as a digital artist to find ways to embrace ambiguity and to see that softness and subtlety and the sort of multi-path nature of that state of being is an answer to the kind, or a counter and antidote to the kind of identification, decision, obsession that is inherent in the control systems of the computer, etc., in the digital age. So that's my hope is that we can practice for catastrophe through including simultaneously. We can't stop making decisions, but we can try to maintain a kind of openness, a quality, a readiness to be open in parallel to this that might, I don't know, in my utopian moments, might create a space where we can have a dialogue between those two things and keep ourselves from running off the edge of catastrophe. And I think it's, in part, one of the roles that media artists can take on is attacking that zone or trying to open it up. I'm gonna finish with one thing, because I see Melenti standing up there.
No, I just want to say that we have 15 more minutes.
Yes, and I want to have questions, so I'm gonna end with something that was really important to me. I brought him up at the beginning, the British author Nicholas Mosley, who had the dubious distinction of being the son of the British fascist leader Sir Oswald Mosley, which scarred him for life and turned him into a curious thinker. But he wrote this series called Catastrophe Practice, and he writes in the introduction to one of the volumes. The title Catastrophe Practice was suggested by a mathematical theory of the 1970s catastrophe theory, which explained how evolution and change might take place in sudden jumps. So could not humans practice to be ready for such a jump? The title also arose from the idea that the human race has in fact reached a point in which old role-playing, old scripts, have become too dangerous. The liking for antagonism, for drama, for tragedy and farce will have to be balanced by a further style of understanding if humans are not to simply blow themselves up. Biologists tell us that there is always a chance of hitherto unnurtured seeds turning up. What humans can do is to prepare the ground, material or mental, on which one seed rather than another might grow. The novels, and I'm back to myself here, the novels vary in tone. In some, characters are achingly self-conscious as they try to find alternate ways of being. In the final book of the series, Hopeful Monsters, which I would recommend to anyone who hasn't read it, it's a fabulous novel, Mosley plays out much of the 19th and 20th century's big ideas, communism, evolution, relativity, psychoanalysis, with and against each other through the lives of two main characters. The title Hopeful Monsters refers to creatures with genetic mutations that may happen to confer qualities upon them that make them more fit for their environment or for a changing environment than normal ones. For me, the most compelling idea in the novel is the idea touched upon in Mosley's quote that I just gave you, that while one cannot control the path of evolution directly, one can create spaces that would provide shelter for and nourish a hopeful monster should it happen to come along. In other words, you can create speculative shelters, spaces that would support the things that you might love should they appear. In the event of catastrophe, when everything is turned upside down, the possibilities are wide open and radical change is possible. These speculative shelters tilt the odds of survival in these unpredictable conditions in favor of your hopeful monsters. So that's where I'll stop. So I love questions, and I love stupid questions because they make me think of answers I didn't already think of. Smart questions, I've figured out all the good smart questions. Yes?
Okay, a stupid question.
Excellent.
How do you resolve the act of seeing and the act of perceiving, or the act of looking and the act of seeing?
Depends on where you draw the line there.
Because I was thinking about your piece with the focus, where at first I get the reference of the idea of the tracking of the eye and the perception within a camera image, as opposed to just what you're. That's not what you're doing, right? In that piece.
I'm not tracking eyes, no, but it's.
But I mean, you're not using an algorithm that's similar.
No, I actually laboriously plotted those trajectories.
Okay, so, and the trajectory is.
I decided what would be the most interesting path. I decided to be an author for once and choose and specify a path that I thought led us through an ambiguous terrain where we were tempted to make certain interpretations that would succeed or fail as the process of unfolding went on. Now, in terms of seeing and looking, what were the words you used?
Yeah,
perceiving and seeing?
That's the two words I was trying to. The difference between looking and then seeing in the sense of looking just as a sort of physical thing, and seeing. Well, maybe I'm a bit mixed up. Either way, but
right.
Seeing as a more conceptual thing.
I remember being incredibly struck by an experiment that they talked about in Scientific American a very long time ago, where they've discovered the eye moves back and forth at a certain rate. I can't remember the name of that particular rhythm. and that you can they were synchronizing things to that movement. So they made a huge circle that was green, and they put a pink triangle or square in the middle. And they started to move it at the exact rate that the eye was moving back and forth. And what happened was the pink rectangle disappeared. Because we only understand that the pink is there when we understand there's a gradient with the green. And when the gradient is lost to us because the eye is not passing back and forth over it, we lose sense of that. So it was an example of how incredibly fabricated, how fictionalized our experience of vision is. And so I kind of divide vision up into a few different things. There are different states of vision. One is identification, where it's almost like a survival thing. We try to identify what we see, and we put labels on everything we see. And that is a certain kind of seeing, which is very projective, and it's desperate. It shuts down. As soon as we've identified something, we stop the process of seeing, because it's no longer sort of necessary for our survival. If you push for long enough, I had this experience in art school where I was forced to look out the window for 3 hours. In the first 15 minutes, I was going, there's a car, there's a tree, this is stupid, And after, I was really angry, really angry, because I just thought this was stupid. And then suddenly, I went from one kind of seeing to another, where the cars in the street felt like they were somehow connected by just an energy of some sort of mutual energy of they were streaming by, and I noticed the slight variation in all the windows across the street and the shapes of trees feeling like amoebas. And I went for 3 hours. I was just exhilarated by everything I was seeing, and that was a really formative experience for me to feel the words pull off the active vision, so that there was this. And to discover that it is possible to pull the words off, that you can be trapped by by your relationship of applying words to everything around you, and that there's value and in that process, but that there is another way of seeing at the same time that doesn't engage with that is really rewarding and is possible, is accessible if you spend the time or you keep yourself open in the right way. I did lots of weird perceptual exercises at art school, like walking down the street, fixing my eye dully at a point in the distance and only focusing on what was exactly at the periphery. So hyper-stimulating my peripheral vision and shutting down the fovea. It's marvelous. I recommend it if you have 2 weeks to throw away. 2 weeks to throw it away, and then you get a couple of months of visual ecstasy. And it's quite fabulous, because just, yes?
For me, the particular irony of the Black Star project is that, and to pick up on this looking and seeing thing, for me the interest is actually in the looking. Because as soon as you see what the image is, it's a kind of end game. You're not interested. I mean, you want to know out of curiosity, but it's the seeing the image which stops the interesting imaginative process of looking. And for me, the looking and the seeing are the same thing, and they never come to an end. But as soon as the image resolves, it strikes me that it's kind of unimaginative in an odd way. I don't know how you feel about that, but because as I watched the image develop, continually I was reading, to use your word, different fictions.
Right.
I was in fact inventing images that I was seeing all along,
Right.
and wanted to stop them at each point, trying to figure out how they could be a resolved image, rather than waiting to get to the Chappaquiddick disaster, which just places us in history, and it's not an escape. It's, as I said,
Batmobile, then it was the Mini Cooper, then
Right, yeah. So yes, there was a decision to be made whether to leave it ambiguous and move on to another image or not. And I made a decision not to for 2 reasons. There were a bunch of different trajectories that I imagined that for it to pass through. One was just a single fovea. So in this case, I add a few linger, establish points. Partly it was because of the nature of the fact that well, 2 things. I did feel that when the image comes, especially when you were confronted with the image right on, the overwhelming experience of the detail was astonishing. And I did not want to let go of that. It was a surprise, it was just like, oh my God. And it was somehow playing very close to what I was interested in about this relationship with detail and blur. So it became, even though it's kind of like a cheap ending in a way, like a reveal, aha, there was something else going on for me there. The other thing was that it was the whole inspiration for the project. 7 artists were invited to explore the archives, and I wanted to I wanted to do justice to the images at the same time as I was using them. But you're right, it is, in a way, there's something very interesting about leaving it always in that ambiguous space. But as it stands, it was at the entrance to the show, so it was the first thing people experienced. By going right through the process to the revelation of the image, it felt like it was a kind of introduction to the whole process of looking at images. Not just holding it off, but going through the whole process. Because we do that process. It happens in a fraction of a second, but we look and we gather like a bee gathering pollen almost. We gather details and we sort of start to fill in until we get to the point where, bang, we have that moment. So that moment does come, and it was part of it, and I felt like it was there. But it's a good point. You could make a lovely piece that never resolves. Yes?
Yeah, thanks so much for the talk. It was great. I was just kind of interested in that experiment you were describing with the raising the hand and the sound. And we all know that Marshall kind of said that technology is an extension of our senses, but I don't know if, I think I remember that Whitehead said that our senses are artificial extensions into the world. But then in this experiment, it also kind of occurred to me that I guess we became this environment, this experimental environment, actually became the extension of that technology, in which then we are susceptible to this technological accident, in a sense that is, I don't know.
It's a very complicated space, which really troubled me through the whole decade of the 90s, really. As I started in the 80s as a kind of utopian, I thought that interactivity was going to save the world. I thought that I was going to be able to make spaces that would encourage us to understand something about, through a kind of affirmation, we'd understand our agency, even in complicated situations. We'd understand our agency, and therefore we would start to act responsibly. And through many experiences of showing to tens of thousands of people, I realized that not many people want to take on that responsibility. They want the experience of being engaged, but they want it to be disassociated from responsibility, which is why the John Cage quote about freedom is so important to me. They have to be together or else we're lost. And yet, what I saw, in the 80s, there was very little new media stuff around, and it certainly wasn't in products that you could buy, in the store. As it started to filter out into products, I realized that the very same thing that I thought could create a special space to experiment with could also create a space where people had an excuse to shut down and shut out. So I became a real dystopian through the 90s, and it was wet blanket at Ars Electronica and everywhere else I went. I was like, Mr. Critic of that. And it took me the whole 90s to get to a point where I realized that on the broad mass consumption side, it was almost inevitable that was going to happen. But on the personal side, for example, working with the Giver of Names, I discovered through working with the Giver of Names such beautiful things about being human that I could not understand without going through this strange path out through the machine and back into myself, that it gave me some hope. That maybe after, some people say there's a 20-year apprenticeship period for working with new media, because for the first 20 years you got to get all this shit out of your system, and then you can finally start to do work with it. That maybe as a culture we will also have this period of foolishness around it, but that it does have potentials. And I like to think of this as a sort of, when I sometimes talk about the computer as a philosophical prosthesis, that it can be that. It has that potential, and we have to, maybe we have to wait, or maybe we have to just keep fighting, or maybe it's as hopeless as Nicholas Mosley's notion of the hopeful monsters, that we can't really plan to make it happen, but we can open spaces where when it does happen, it's supported. And so that people who think, oh my God, I'm insane because I'm having this idea, realize there's someone else having this idea, which is what I think saves all of us artists at some point in our life, going, oh my God, I'm not alone having this weird experience of this. And that, so maybe, I don't know where to put the optimistic side of myself in this question yet, but you're absolutely right. It's a very complicated, vulnerable space that I'm talking about, and to be vulnerable to a system that's being generated by, industrial capitalism is a bit of a complicated space, unless we work hard to find different relationships there. I don't know the answer. I just hope. I try to keep hopeful sometimes.